Welcome to Clarity, a podcast powered by the Thomson Reuters Institute. I'm Zach Warren, the Institute's Technology and Innovation Insights lead. In each episode, we dive deep into a single question from decision makers and thought leaders from legal, corporate, tax accounting and audit, and government communities. In today's episode, we discuss the big question: what do today's law firms need to do to meet their strategic objectives? It's one thing for a law firm to meet and map out its strategy for the next 1, 3, or even 5 years, but it's wholly another to actually meet those strategic objectives. Just about every firm approaches one stumbling block or another along the way, whether it's an unexpected turn of events, higher costs or compensation issues, or a pesky firm culture that doesn't allow for as much change as you'd like. But that doesn't mean that these barriers are insurmountable. As data from TRI's recent Stellar Performance Survey notes, it's through the alignment of culture, strategy, and compensation that firms can weather the storm and meet their strategic objectives. Today's conversation is about how to get to that alignment. Drawing from their own experience working with law firms on strategy projects, take a listen as Eve Starks, Senior Consultant at the Thomson Reuters Institute, and Becky Halat, Senior Manager Client Services at the Institute, discuss how law firms can find their own path to strategy success.
All right. Well, today we're talking workplace culture, right? Workplace culture matters because it really shapes how people work, connect, and ultimately how they succeed. So, a strong culture really boosts engagement, it supports strategic goals, it improves client relationships, and it helps firms adapt to change, which, as we've seen, is happening fast and furious, whether we like it or not these days. And so that's why we set out to understand the nuances of law firm cultures in our 2025 Standout Lawyer Survey. So I'm going to start with kind of a foundational insight that we took from the research. We looked at how law firms define their culture, and what we found is that most firms fall into one of four cultural footprints. These are based on two key dimensions. So, work environment, whether the firm leads towards more high intensity or more work life balance, and then innovative approach, whether the firm is traditional or more innovative. And I don't know that we want to tie that innovation too much to AI at this point. It's certainly a factor, but let's set that aside for today. So, you end up with four quadrants that split into traditional slash work life balance, traditional slash high intensity, etc. Now, here's the surprising part, right? Lawyer satisfaction is consistent across all four types, all four cultures. Whether a firm is bold and competitive or collegial and mission driven, satisfaction scores are nearly identical. And that tells us something, I think, very important about the state of culture. It's not which culture you have, it's about how well that culture is understood and how well it's ultimately lived. And that culture is a critical factor to evaluate when you're setting up your firm's growth strategy, right? Firms often jump straight into strategic planning by asking, what do we want to achieve? They're skipping that critical step, though, of are we culturally set up to achieve those goals? And that's where many firms struggle, right? Most can articulate their values on paper, but the real test is whether those values show up in daily operations, right? And we encourage firms then to ask two simple but really powerful questions at this time. What are your core values and mission? And then, secondly, how do we want to be perceived, both by our clients and also by our lawyers, right? What's the internal perception? So, Eve, I'm going to kick it over to you. What can you tell us about why these questions are important for law firm leaders to reflect on? I know you've had a lot of experience talking with these folks. So, what is it that makes these questions critical?
They're important because that self-reflection and awareness is a really underrated essential when making decisions, particularly because as a leader, you're going to need to inspire buy-in and perhaps change as a result of the decisions that you're making. So holding up a mirror to the firm or even just to yourself as a leadership team is a really crucial first step, whether or not you're setting up a new strategy, refining your go-to-market message, or evolving service delivery. I might just add, though, to those questions that you posed, Becky, a third question, which is our culture commonly understood, experienced, and practiced? One of the common challenges that we've come across in our work with firms is those that have been through a growth period, particularly if they've done that through inorganic growth and they're now getting used to being big. Sometimes what that means is there's pockets of the firm that aren't necessarily culturally aligned. And that happens even for the firms that have been the most diligent about bringing in perhaps lateral teams where they believe there's really close cultural cohesion. There's always going to be a little bit of a nuance. And that is particularly true if you're a leader of a really large organization or even a global organization where you have those regional cultural considerations to take into account. Frankly, if you're a leader of a large organization, you are going to have to get used to the fact there's going to be some nuance and some flex in your culture. But the challenge comes in where that goes beyond being a bit of a subtle nuance into a really entrenched difference in terms of how your people experience and perceive the culture of the firm. That can actually have quite significant impacts across more aspects of talent engagement than you might naturally expect, which I think you're going to unpack a little bit more, Becky.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. It's not the kind of culture that drives satisfaction. What we found in the research is that it's really how consistently that culture is perceived across the firm, right? Across different lawyers and other folks. So our analysis revealed that lawyers at firms with strong cultural consistency or alignment reported significantly higher levels of satisfaction compared to those at firms that were where consistency was weaker, right? And it didn't stop there, not just with satisfaction, right? So high consistency firms also outperform in key areas like leadership, growth opportunities, feeling respected, the ability to be oneself at work, among others. So, really key drivers to engagement and doing well at work. So ultimately, what does this mean, right? When lawyers know what to expect, right? People don't like surprises and see the firm's culture reflected in everything that they're doing from daily decisions to more strategic moves. They're just going to be more engaged, right? And we know that engaged lawyers stick around. That's why we emphasize that strategy and culture really do need to align. When they don't, it sends these mixed signals. Lawyers get confused, and that confusion leads to disengagement and then ultimately turnover, which obviously costs the firm a lot of money and a lot of resources. So, to give a real world example, as part of a recent strategy project, we used our cultural alignment assessment with a firm's leadership team. It wasn't a big production, not a big to do, just a quick survey asking leaders to place the firm on key cultural continuums like centralized versus decentralized, formal versus informal, niche versus broad, and so on. And the results were pretty compelling. Even among the leaders, while there was clear alignment in certain areas, there was also significant splits in others. So, for example, on views of collaboration, those were divided. Some of the leaders said that the firm was highly collaborative, others didn't. Same for niche versus broad service focus. Now, imagine that kind of impact downstream on that split, right? If half of your leadership sees the firm as a niche provider and the other half sees it as full service, market messaging is going to be pretty inconsistent, right? And that confusion trickles down into lawyers, clients, and recruits, right? So this kind of assessment really helps firms pinpoint where cultural inconsistencies can block that strategic success. It's the first step in strategy work, understanding how aligned your people are on what the firm stands for. And ultimately, we shouldn't just focus on partners for this kind of assessment, right? We want to include leaders from BD, IT, HR, right? All of those acronyms that we need to have. They're also going to provide a meaningful piece of the puzzle. Their perspective is going to shape how strategy gets implemented, right? They're a big piece of how this work is being done. And so these conversations can help firms identify the cultural elements that they need to reinforce to make strategy really stick.
I love that example. I think it's such a compelling example of how diverse understandings of culture can be. Because, as you say, that wasn't even within a firm, that was just within a leadership team that we saw all of that
Yeah.
difference. So it really always makes me reflect when we talk about that. It always makes me reflect on a kind of constant refrain that we're giving from the Thomson Reuters Institute, which is law firms need to be more focused. And we've talked about this previously with reference to how law firms can drive greater impact in the market by having a focused proposition to buyers. So coming away from an internal perspective for a moment and thinking about it externally, when we're working with firms and with leadership teams, we use what we call our Apex Focus framework to support leaders with really understanding the matrix of the legal market and really identifying where their firm can most effectively compete. What we see is that firms that have a really clear apex focus outpace their competitors in terms of mind share, in terms of the extent to which they're considered for target work types, and in terms of demand for their services, because they are sending a really clear, focused message to the market. Not only that, but having that really clear focus strategy enables those firms to more effectively, more quickly deploy their limited resources to achieve a really outsized impact. And that is because everybody is pulling in the same direction. Leadership, partners, associates, your business professionals, everybody is testing their decisions against the same strategic framework and taking the same message to market. And that is a lot more impactful, surprisingly, than 100 partners saying 100 different things about what the firm does. The
Shocking.
reason that I mention that and bring that in is I think this cultural dynamic really reveals a really similar need for focus and focused messaging within the talent base. So knowing that consistency and lived experience of culture is impactful in, as you said, the level of satisfaction that our people feel and mitigating flight risk, it's really imperative then that articulation of values, expectation, behaviors is common and it's consistent. And of course, also that it's supported by governance and a functional infrastructure that really delivers everybody within the firm a common understanding of this central ethos and this culture in practice. So, to your point, Becky, having that be aligned with the broader strategy of what a firm is trying to achieve is a really critical success factor. And perhaps just to bring that to life a little bit, one of the common challenges that we see in strategic implementation phases is that in the heat and in the excitement of ambitious thinking and planning, leaders develop strategies or initiatives that can be out of step with their culture. And an example of that might be if you're a firm that really values work-life balance, you pride yourself on that, you pride yourself on delivering that to your employees, and maybe in the excitement of looking at where the opportunity is in the market, you've decided that you want to pivot the firm to a highly competitive market segment where there are really punishing expectations from clients as to constant availability and really rapid responsiveness. Now, it's not to say that your work-life balance culture should preclude you from that necessarily, but executing upon that strategy from a position as a firm that prides that work-life balance culture is going to look a little bit different compared to if you were a firm with a much more intensive culture that had the same target. So I want to be really clear about this. It's not to say that strategy should dictate culture or vice versa. Culture isn't static, it evolves, it changes over time. So when we're working with firms and we're looking at their ambition, when they want to compete, where they believe they should be playing, with sympathy to their culture, the message we want to deliver is your culture shouldn't be the reason that you don't make brave and bold strategic choices. Your culture must not stop you from making necessary decisions to make sure your firm remains competitive in a really challenging market. Actually, the most impactful strategies will harness the positive and powerful aspects of a culture to deliver results. If your strategy requires behaviors or a mindset shift from the historical culture, you just need to be aware of the scale of the challenge and what that means for what you're asking of your people. So, how are you going to communicate that change to them? And really, really crucially, how are you going to support them in making that change to actually deliver on your strategy?
I appreciate what you're saying, Eve, because I really like that it's not restrictive in terms of what firms can
Right.
achieve. There's options, we have choices, but we just need to take into account what our culture will allow and really be realistic about the changes that need to happen because of that. It speaks to really, I think I agree further with you, the importance of the awareness of what your cultural perception is, right? Because we can't do what you're suggesting without really having a core base of that knowledge. And so part of the challenge with this strategy and cultural dependency is that culture is often seen as intangible, right? Very squishy, hard to define, hard to measure. In addition to the Apex focus framework, we also use a values based charter to support firms with thoroughly articulating what their culture is and what might be true in the future. So, in our work with law firms, we often see that leadership deeply values a firm culture. They will bring that up time and again. We want to keep our culture. Our culture is really important. However, what we find less common is taking a step back to assess whether the way that culture is evolving still aligns with the firm's strategic goals. Because again, back to your point, Eve, it's always going to be changing, right? Whether it's delivering the experience that both talent and clients are expecting. Culture isn't static, always evolving. That's why, as part of any cultural engagement, we're always looking to help leadership articulate what aspects of our culture do we want to preserve and what elements might we need to evolve to equip us for the future and maintain that ability to be competitive. So the charter probes into various aspects of a firm's culture, including values, ethos, ambition, and focus, to support firms with interrogating those surface level perceptions of culture and developing a robust, thorough understanding of how people experience the firm. This tool helps firms reflect on really what they truly value, right? And how those values show up in practice. It's not just about slogans, right? Slogans are easy. It's about behaviors, decision making, and governance. And the purpose of this exercise is to help leadership create kind of a consistent message about who the firm is to its people, what that experience is that they're delivering. So once it's clearly articulated, it provides a litmus test to evaluate governance structures, initiatives impacting the firm's people, and test the firm's strategy to ensure that proposed strategic change is feasible and aligned with that culture.
And just to build on that, Becky, the second step in that exercise then is thinking about which aspects of a firm's culture are supporting its success. As I said earlier, the most powerful strategy should really emphasize certain aspects or build off certain aspects of a firm's culture. But also, potentially, there are aspects which might be negatively impacting our people or holding the firm back. A pretty common one that leaders grapple with in law firms and in professional services more widely is a culture of client protectionism. So it's my client, it's not our client in terms of mindset. That can be a pretty limiting factor for firms that are looking to build deeper, broader relationships with their clients. So looking out to build out those touch points and have more people involved with relationship management. That's very, very challenging if partners have a, no, this is my client and I'm the only person that's really going to be interfacing with these people. So using the same framework, we support leaders with developing a similarly detailed picture of where their culture ideally would be in the future if everything has gone as it should. So perhaps using the same strategic period, if you're doing a 10-year strategic plan, looking ahead to 10 years, what is your culture really going to look and feel like? And that takes into account not only strategic ambition and how that is changing the firm, but also external forces. How is technology impacting the production and the reinforcement of our culture? What do we need to consider about new generations entering our talent force and also entering leadership roles? Of course, then you have two pictures, and once you have both, we can really identify what are the gaps, what steps do we need to take to shift the culture or evolve the culture towards this ideal future state. And again, crucially, the same message, how can we support talent through that change? That roadmap becomes a really critical component then of your overall strategic plan. So hopefully we have set out a really, really compelling case for why alignment with culture and strategy is critical. But if only it was as simple as just balancing those two aspects. There is a third ingredient to the secret sauce, isn't there, Becky?
Yeah, there is, and it's going to be very, very delightful for everyone to hear that the third element that we really can't ignore is compensation. Everyone's favorite favorite part to tackle. So often when we're interviewing partners as part of a strategy exercise, we'll hear something along the lines of, leadership will tell you that they value X, but all that really matters is why, right? That perception is a problem because compensation really drives behavior. If you say that you value collaboration but your compensation structures only reward individual origination, or your partners believe that that's all you're going to reward, you're sending mixed signals about what's actually important and what the firm wants you to be doing and how they want you to be spending your time. What we found is that 4 in 10 standout lawyers, these lawyers that we surveyed as part of our study, say that their firm's compensation models is only moderately or poorly aligned with its culture and strategic goals. And that's a big problem, right? Particularly since we also found that when compensation is highly aligned with culture and strategy, lawyer satisfaction actually jumps up by 66%. So a huge bump. Advocacy goes up and flight risk goes down. Again, resourcing, we want to be sure that we're maintaining, keeping that flight risk at bay. At the heart of this all is clarity, right? When culture, strategy, and compensation are all moving in step, it's very clear to people operating within the firm, whether you're a partner, associate of counsel, a business service professional, it's very clear what they need to do, what their role is in driving collective success. And that's a big factor in employee satisfaction, right? Being part of what's driving organizational success. That's definitely easier said than done, right? Super simple. Just make sure to have all that clarity. And if you're a law firm leader listening to this and thinking that's a challenging balancing act to achieve, we absolutely hear you. And this is why using the frameworks like the Apex Focus, the Values Charter is so helpful in strategic decision making, because they provide those really clear structures that simplify all of these complex interlocking parts, because everything needs to be moving together. This challenge that I'm outlining gets even harder as firms grow, right? Alignment between compensation and strategy drops sharply as firm size increases. So when we look at the smallest firms, those with up to 100 lawyers, nearly 70% say their compensation is well aligned with firm strategy. 30% still a big chunk, but 70% are see that alignment. At firms with more than 5,000 lawyers, the biggest firms, that drops to just 39%. So less than 40% see that alignment. That means the flip side, over 60% do not experience that alignment. So larger firms, Eve, you made the point earlier, facing more complexity, not surprising that we're seeing this difference. Conflicting goals across practice groups, decentralized decision making, legacy systems that often haven't scaled with the growth that they've experienced. And then, of course, we can't forget that partnership model, right? Lawyers are owners, not employees, which makes shifting priorities even harder, right? Firms that have grown rapidly often find that their strategy and systems no longer fit. They need to move from more entrepreneurial to managed, but that shift can really create a lot of friction in firms. So firms often waste time revisiting compensation without first understanding what values and behaviors they really want to embed. So, evaluating culture early ensures that strategic initiatives are achievable and that they'll actually drive success. So, with that, Eve, give us some final recommendations for these law firm leaders that are listening, that are really trying to future proof their firm culture.
The main takeaway that I've had from working with firms on developing strategy in an environment of really extensive, rapid change is you win nothing by avoiding the tough questions. Law firms are typically really good at navigating challenging environments. We saw that during the pandemic, but it's important to acknowledge now the industry itself is facing quite extensive disruption, and the winners from this are going to be those firms that are brave enough to acknowledge that change and to be really honest about what it means for their business, really honest with themselves as a leadership team, really honest with the people in the community within their firms. We've been working with a few firms that are at different stages of the strategy cycle, and we're hearing one common underlying worry at the moment, which is we're concerned that we're going to sleepwalk into having done nothing significant to equip our firm and our people for the future. I've found that law firm leaders are actually really sensitive to their role of stewards of the firm. It's a pretty hefty responsibility to leave it in a better place than they found it. And that, of course, is really challenging when you're looking at the future and you don't know what it holds. You just know that it's going to be really quite different. So what can you actually do to make sure that you are achieving this strategy, compensation, and cultural alignment that we're seeing is so critical for sustained success and for talent satisfaction and retention? Step number one is assessing your culture. do not make the mistake of assuming that everybody in your firm thinks the same as you do. I love to ask leaders how the most junior person in their team or the most junior person in their organization would describe the culture. Even better, ask that junior person directly. But if you do have the opportunity to really formally survey and understand how your people are experiencing the culture of the firm, I guarantee that you will learn something about your firm and about your people that will be really powerful for when you're making decisions. So that would be step number one. Step number two would be establishing a really clear, focused strategy that provides your talent with a really clear understanding of what the firm is, what it does, and then critically, how they contribute and what the firm offers them. We always need to be holding those two things together. What are we asking for from our people to achieve those goals, and what do they get from us in return? The third piece, and just picking up on the final point that you were making, Becky, is reviewing your compensation structure with sympathy to the change you're looking to create. You don't want to be a leader of one of those firms that Becky referenced where partners are going, oh yeah, they're going to tell you that this is important, but actually all they're measuring is this one thing. That's really counteractive to the behaviors that you're looking to instill to achieve the strategy and deliver on those goals that you set out. So ensuring your compensation structure is really aligned with those behaviors is the third really important step.
Thank you, Becky, and thank you, Eve, for your insights. Some firms may view strategy only as a guiding light rather than a work in progress, but tough questions will inevitably arise. And as our speakers aptly noted, you shouldn't avoid the tough questions. Whether adjustments in compensation, firm culture, or some other strategic element are necessary, a whole lot of upfront planning will make those roadblocks mere bumps compared to strategic catastrophes. Thank you as always for joining us for Clarity, powered by the Thomson Reuters Institute. You can follow or subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast platform, and don't forget to share with your colleagues and leave a 5-star review. For more data-driven analysis of today's professional services market and in-depth conversations with industry thought leaders, please visit us online at thomsonreuters.com/institute and follow us on LinkedIn under the Thomson Reuters Institute. Clarity is a production of Thomson Reuters, copyright Thomson Reuters 2025.